I wanted to share our birth experience because it is really a balance of a home birth experience plus a hospital experience. And in that way, it's a little bit unique because we experienced both sides of that. I want to preface this by saying that our birth is sort of broken into two parts. We had part A, which was my dream birth experience, textbook home birth. Part B, which was not anything that we had expected, comes with a bit of a trigger warning because there were some more serious complications that actually led to us going to the hospital. So when I share this story, I'm going to start with part A, that home birth experience, but I will let you know when I'm transitioning into the second part because some of that information and some of those details are going to be a little bit more sensitive. But this is our story and I hope you enjoy it. Hi, Amelia. Hello. This is something that I've been meaning to do for a couple of months, but it always just felt like it wasn't the perfect timing. And I'm realizing that with having a baby, there's never going to be the perfect time. So I was due with Amelia on July 19th. And prior to my due date, leading up to it, about 10 days before my due date, I started having contractions and I thought that I was going into labor. I always envisioned that it would be a hospital birth, but the closer we got to actually having the baby, the more I pictured that experience happening at home, and specifically in our new home that we had just moved into in March. So over time, we started to plan for that home birth experience. We were very open to the idea that if at any time it became unsafe or uncomfortable to be at home, that we would very happily make the decision to do a hospital transfer. But the plan was to start at home and to stay here for as long as it was safe and comfortable to do so. And so when I started having these contractions, we had all of our gear all set up with knowing that she was going to be born, at any point in the next couple of weeks. We had brought up mattress from downstairs that we had wrapped in a drop sheet, and we had a pool that we were planning on blowing up and using. And so we had all of this equipment ready to go. And when I started having these contractions, it was on a Sunday. I said, okay, Kyle, it's happening. I think, things are really starting to get going with this. And so I got the TENS machine on because they were already feeling fairly uncomfortable, like sort of like a period cramp at that point. It just sort of carried on with these contractions that weren't changing. And that went on for several hours. They weren't changing in intensity. They were happening every few minutes, but they weren't getting closer together and they weren't getting stronger. And so at some point I thought, okay, I should try to get some sleep because this really might start to ramp up in the next few hours. So I went to bed. At some point in the night, those contractions stopped and I woke up in the morning and felt perfectly normal. So that was very confusing. And then we ended up going in for an appointment with our midwives that morning. It did not look like I was in labor. Carry on as usual. This happened several times. This is called prodromal labor. So a little bit different from early labor in that it does not actually progress to having active labor with contractions that get closer together and stronger. And instead what happens is it seems like labor's starting, you have contractions, they feel very much like true labor contractions, but they just don't progress. And then eventually it peters off, or often that happens once you go to sleep. So this went on and off for 10 days being in prodromal labor. After 2 days of this was when I decided to call it quits with trying to work because it was just not possible for me to keep trying to see patients. Mentally, I was so distracted. Physically, I was uncomfortable because I was having these contractions every day that would just be on and off. So this happened for 9 days leading up to my due date. And then my due date came and went, no sign of baby. I was feeling extremely discouraged. Kyle and I went out to dinner that night, whether we were gonna spend our due date either having a baby or not having a baby. We wanted it to be a celebration of that milestone. And I came home from that dinner and I got in the shower and I cried. I was just feeling really tired and discouraged that she hadn't come yet. I was anxious to meet her, and my body, I just felt like it had been playing tricks on me for over a week, and I just wanted her to come. So the next morning, I carried on life as usual. I had planned to attend an online business training on bookkeeping, so set myself up at my desk, We had a team of roofers that were working on the roof outside on the deck, and I got up to go to the bathroom on a break during this online session, and while I was in the bathroom, my water broke. I thought my water had broken the week before, and it hadn't. I had gone to the midwives, they checked and said, no, that's not what that was. This time, I knew that there was no mistaking it. I was like, yeah, okay, this is not the same amount of fluid as what was happening before. So literally within minutes of my water breaking, I was having strong, active contractions. So I called Kyle. I said, okay, you need to come home now. My water just broke. It's baby time. Meanwhile, we still have this team of roofers that's working on the deck right outside the windows. And I'm starting to get the home space set up. Kyle was home within a few minutes, so we're pulling the pool into the living room and we're getting the mattress set up on the ground, because I had called my midwives and they said, yep, just, stay at home, make yourself as comfortable as possible. We're not gonna arrive until your contractions are closer together. It was like once they were maybe 3 minutes apart, that's when they would come. So they said, call us back when that happens. Within, I would say 20 minutes of the contractions starting, they were already just a few minutes apart. Called the midwives back. So they were here within an hour. I was like full force, strong contractions. It was like hard for me to know exactly how much time had passed, but I was just fully in it. It was like the rest of the world was melting away around me. We had our team of midwives that were here. Kyle was here. We had our doula with us as well. She was absolutely wonderful. I spent that first portion of my labor on the mattress while they were getting the pool set up. I'm gonna take a pause here because this little one needs to go down for a nap. So I'm having contractions on the mattress, on the floor, in the living room, which is exactly where I am positioned right now. The tub is being filled with water, and meanwhile, the roofers are still outside working on the roof. So at this point, I said to my husband, Kyle, I think it's time to call off the roofers. He goes outside, tells them what's going on, which was funny because they had seen me walking around in the house earlier that morning. They could see how pregnant I was. One of them had actually called Kyle and said, your wife looks to be fairly pregnant. Do you want us to give you a call if it seems like something's happening or if she's going into labor? And Kyle had said, oh no, she is close to the end of her pregnancy, but she'll give me a call. And then within minutes of him hanging up on that phone call is when he received my phone call saying that my water had broken. So he went outside, called off the roofing team, they packed up. By that time, the pool was filled with water. It had to be a very specific temperature because it needs to be safe for baby to enter into. We had to really monitor that closely, and both my doula and Kyle were constantly adjusting the temperature by adding warm or cool water into the tub, and we were measuring the temp as this was happening. As soon as I got into the water, I felt instant relief. The contractions, I was surprised because I was really scared of what they were going to feel like. In fact, the whole idea of pregnancy and giving birth was something that I was so scared of for most of my life that when I talked about having a family one day, I actually said that I would likely not be the person who would give birth. If I was going to have a family, I would consider adoption or a surrogacy pregnancy, but it was truly something that it was one of my greatest fears in life was pregnancy and giving birth. One of the things I think that made that so scary for me was that I've never really injured myself. I've never broken a bone, I've never experienced extreme pain, and that fear of the unknown was a massive barrier for me. So one of the things that we did during our pregnancy to prepare for the birth was we took a hypnobirthing course, which was absolutely incredible. Learned so many techniques that helped to prepare me for what that birth experience would feel like, but also to address some of the inherent fears that I had around giving birth and to really break those down and understand what am I scared of and tackle some of those fears before we went into that process. And honestly, I feel like that made a world of difference, especially because, as I mentioned at the start of this video, I did have some complications, and that was the time when those tools became really useful. So as soon as I got into the water, I felt that relief. The sensation of the contractions that I was having when I was on the mattress, it was pain for sure, but more than pain, the word that comes to mind was intensity. There was just this intensity that made it hard to focus on anything else. The rest of the world around me sort of closed off, and I was so connected to what was happening with my body, which I found to be a really powerful and really amazing experience. It was to the point where after I gave birth, I had to ask if we had music playing in the background because I had zero recollection of having that playlist on. Apparently it was on the entire time. At one point my doula had asked, do you want to put on your hypnosis track so that you can get into that hypnosis state? That was something that was not even accessible to me at that point. I said, no, I don't need the guided track. I'm in it right now. And then when I got in the water, it just provided this cushion around my body that just instantly took the edge off of what I was feeling. So that felt incredible. I even have actually some photos of me sitting in the tub with a big smile on my face and a thumbs up, because that was the moment when I felt a lot of relief. Up until that point, I think I had maybe taken a Gravol and a Tylenol for pain relief, but truly the water was the most effective pain relief that I felt during my birth. So I was in the water for quite a while, and then I started to feel the urge to push. And people will tell you, you don't have to think about when that needs to happen, like your body is going to tell you. And that couldn't have been more true. It felt like it wasn't even voluntary. I started pushing, and as soon as that happened, I said to my midwives, okay, I think something's changing here. I feel like I can't help it, but my body is bearing down and I'm starting to push during a contraction. So they said, okay, come on out of the water, let's check and see where you're at. Now at this point, so my water had broken at 11 a.m. At this point, it was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So it really had not been a very long time that I had been in active labor. But when they checked me, I was already 9 centimeters dilated. So very close to that stage where you're able to push. You can start pushing at around 10 centimeters. They said, you know, you can either continue working through this, or if you're able to give us one big push, it's just the last part of your cervix. We just need to push that lip around the baby's head, and then you're safe to start pushing. I said, okay, let's do that. So gave a good push. They were able to open up the cervix that last little bit, and then I was able to get back in the water. And honestly, as soon as I was able to start pushing, oh, it felt so good. Like it felt so good to be able to harness that energy and that power that you're feeling and feel like you're able to do something with it. As I mentioned, it's not so much the pain of the contraction, it's the intensity of it. And when you are surrendering to that, it's really, really hard to not feel like you're able to do anything with that huge amount of energy and force that's being created in the womb. So when you finally get the instruction that you can start pushing, it's like, yes, I feel like I can do something with that now. So the pushing part felt good. It was hard. It was taxing, like definitely energy consuming. And I felt like I couldn't eat, which made it tricky because I wanted to be able to keep my energy up, but I just couldn't even think about eating anything. So I was sipping water, and I think coconut water at that time, which I did find helpful. I had been in the water for over an hour at that point pushing. And when you are having a water birth, it's much less hands-on with your care team. So they're not doing as many checks as they would be if you were not in the water, because it's not as accessible to actually get close to baby. At that point, they said, can you feel down? Can you feel baby's head at all? And I said, no, I can't feel baby. So they said, okay, why don't you come out of the water and we'll check you and see where things are at. So they checked and they said, yep, it's progressing nicely, but maybe let's consider trying a different position if that feels comfortable for you. You might feel like you have a bit more leverage. And that's exactly the challenge that I felt like I was having, was that in the water, I felt like I couldn't get the leverage that I needed because it was like buoyant. So it was sort of like gravity was pressing down, but then there was this force that was buffering that, and it made it hard to feel like I was able to move her. So then I got out of the water and decided to try pushing on the mattress that was on the ground. I tried one push on my back and immediately decided that was not for me. I just felt like I had no power in that position. I found it actually really painful to be in that position. Intuitively, I felt like being on my hands and knees was going to be where I wanted to go. So I tried that, and I knew right away that that was going to be a better position for me. So I pushed in that position for, it was about an hour actually that I was pushing there, and I was starting to get really tired. At one point, I don't even remember who it was on my team who said this, but they were saying, okay, you're going to rest for this next time in between contractions, but on the rest, you need to try to find a way to keep her down. And I kept hearing that message, keep her down. And that's when I realized I could feel this happening, where I'd push and I would feel her descend, and then I would relax and I would feel her lift back up. And it sort of felt like it was going one step forward, one step back, where it should have been 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So somehow that cue, it was like something turned on in my brain that I figured out how to use my core to keep her down so that the next push was actually pushing her further. I kept pushing. It was really, really hard. I was very grateful that I had been very active during my pregnancy because it was a lot of physical work. And then that's when I started to feel, when she started crowning, definitely a different sensation. My midwives had said, you're so close. Now you need to just relax for this next contraction. Give your body a chance to open up a little bit. And that instruction is given so that it decreases the chance of having a tear. I felt like with all of the pelvic floor physio that I had done, that I was very in tune with my body. I knew how to connect to that area to relax. And when that happened, again, she was able to pass a little bit further, and I knew she was very close. At one point, they said, oh, we can see her hair. She has a head full of hair. Do you want to reach down and feel it? And I said, no, I don't. I'm a little bit busy right now. And I think it was within the next couple of pushes, I finally had her out. It was just incredible. I reached down, they instructed me on how to sort of catch her when she came out. I held onto her and I rolled over onto my back. And it was at that point that they were explaining that when she was coming out, she had her arm like this. And so that's why it was feeling like there was so much effort that was required to push, because we were trying to get an arm out at the same time that her head was coming through. My midwives were saying if her arm had been down, it likely would have been less time and less effort that was spent in the pushing phase. But she was out, and I was very grateful at that point that everything was looking good. The rest of that is a little bit of a blur. I just remember being in a state of awe and hearing my baby cry and just holding her and crying myself, just the most ecstatic tears and the most ecstatic joy that I had ever felt. The hormone rush helps with that. And then I'm holding the baby, they check her, everything looks great. They check me, everything looks great. A few minutes later, the placenta releases and everything's intact and looks normal. One thing that I had known about in advance, because I had done some reading on this, I still don't think I was prepared for how this was going to feel. After you give birth, your uterus doesn't stop contracting. It continues with its contractions, and that is an important mechanism by your body to help to close the wound from where the placenta detaches, which helps to stop the bleeding. But those contractions, they feel the same way that the other labor contractions felt. I feel like maybe a lot of people don't talk about this part because you're also holding your baby and interacting with your baby, and so there's certainly a distraction there, but those contractions are still happening. And one of the parts that was fairly uncomfortable is that in order to help that uterus to contract, your healthcare providers will provide this uterine massage where they are pressing down on the uterus to help to expel any blood that's there to help the uterus contract. So that was fairly uncomfortable, but again, buffered by so much joy of having my baby born. After a few minutes, they were doing some different tests and things with Amelia, and my doula and one of my midwives helped me to the bathroom so that I could rinse off. And then the rest of our team and my husband sort of packed up the area in the living room where we had some of the drop sheets and things like that. And we just spent the next little while, I think my midwife stayed with me for, I think it was about 2 hours, maybe 3 hours after the birth. She immediately was able to latch, which was amazing. So got her breastfeeding. At that point, I was able to focus on my appetite again. I was very hungry. I was ready to eat. So Kyle ordered some sushi and we had some wine that was chilling. And so we all shared sushi together and cheersed with a glass of wine. And we just sat there and marinated in the bliss. This is sort of the start of the story of the second part of our birth, where I had gone to the bathroom and there was some heavier bleeding that was happening. And I had asked my midwives, is that normal? It was the student midwife who was in the bathroom with me, and she said, you know what, that looks like a little on the heavy side, but I'm just going to double check with our other midwife. And they all agreed, yep, it's a little bit heavy, but it's well within the normal limits. So because of that, I received a second injection of oxytocin, which helps to get the uterus to contract. I had already had one, but I was on to the second one just to boost that a little bit more. So we had been spending time together as a family with our care team for a couple of hours, and then it was time for them to pack up and go home. And when they left, I FaceTimed my parents, and I realized I hadn't had time to contact them at any point from the time my water broke until I gave birth, because my water broke at 11 a.m. and she was here by 4:36. So it was quite quick. They were very shocked when I showed them their granddaughter for the first time. And that was part A, our dream home birth experience. It was truly incredible. All the things that I was afraid of in terms of the pain, they felt so secondary. I felt like such a warrior after I gave birth. I felt like I could do anything after what I had just done. And it was just the most amazing day of my life. I'm going to transition into part B of our story. And again, I want to share that this comes with a trigger warning, because I did suffer some complications after the birth, quite serious, that did land me in hospital. So please, if you don't want to hear this portion of the story, this would be the time to turn this video off. So we had been home. Care providers left about an hour earlier. I was on the phone with my parents, and while we were FaceTiming them, I started to feel pretty dizzy, a little bit sweaty, a little bit nauseous, and I also realized I hadn't gone to the bathroom in a little while. So I told them I was going to get off the phone, and I went to get up to go to the bathroom. As soon as I stood up, I felt this rush of blood leave my body and immediately felt very faint. So I got down on the ground and I laid on the ceramic floor, and I told Kyle, I think you need to call our midwives, because I just felt some bleeding and it didn't feel normal. They were very clear about this is what you can expect and what would be normal, and this is not. So we called them. They showed up within minutes after that phone call, did an assessment and said, yeah, you know what? You've definitely had some heavier bleeding. Gave me another injection, ergot, which also helps to activate those uterine contractions. So just trying to kick that up a little bit. And at that point, we made the decision to call an ambulance, because I didn't feel like I was able to get up off the floor. I felt like as soon as I came up from that horizontal position that I was at risk of losing consciousness. So called paramedics, and they came in. I was in really, honestly, good spirits at this point, which is surprising, because this is exactly the kind of situation that I was really, really scared about. But I think because I was so prepared going into my birth, I knew what the risks were. I knew how to tell if something didn't feel right, and I knew, giving birth at home, that we were completely ready to make that hospital transfer at any point. It was just bizarre that everything in the actual birth itself was textbook normal, and then it wasn't until 4 hours after I gave birth that I ended up having this hemorrhage. So went to the hospital. I was cracking jokes with the paramedics in the ambulance, which I think they found quite surprising, but I think just, still having that rush of those feel-good hormones and chemicals, there was not a part of me that felt scared. I felt safe. I felt cared for. I knew that I was exactly where I needed to be in that moment, and I trusted the people who were caring for me. Once I showed up at the hospital, and I was on my own. Kyle and Amelia were not with me because they were not coming in the ambulance. They were following in the car. She needed to be put in the car seat for that ride. So I got to the hospital and immediately was assessed. Everyone that was working with me, the nurses, the OB, were amazing. Bedside manner was incredible. Again, I felt just really safe, really well cared for. And we went upstairs, and there was a lot that happened in the next 45 minutes. I had most of the staff that were on that floor were attending to me. There were IV lines that were being set up. There were medications that were being administered to help get those contractions going. There was a bladder catheter that was put in, and all of this was sort of happening at the same time. And Kyle was not here for this. And I was actually quite grateful that he wasn't in the room, because it was overwhelming. And again, I did not feel scared. I felt good, but I also recognized that that was a lot because of the hormones that were circulating in my system. And I knew that he didn't have those same hormones, and it would be really, really hard to be present and observing everything that was going on in that room. So he ended up showing up. 45 minutes to an hour later. And when he arrived, he told me that the car seat was missing a part, and he ended up having to install a different car seat that we had, but he didn't know how to install it. So he was watching YouTube videos and trying to figure out how to get it set up and getting help with the midwife, caring for this very, very newborn baby. I had no experience doing that. So it took him a little while to get to the hospital, but by the time he arrived, I was stable and all of the interventions had already been done. And at that point, I was resting and I was in a state of shock. So there was quite a bit of shaking, like I had a tremor that was happening. And the worst part about that was just that my body was so exhausted after the physical work of giving birth, and I just wanted to be able to rest. But my muscles were so sore and tired, and my hips, from having these constant contractions because I was shivering so hard. They had put me under this little heated blanket, which was lovely, but for some reason I wasn't able to stop the shaking. And at that point, my blood pressure was still very low. My heart rate was quite low. Things were stable, but not normal. So they had the bed in what's called a Trendelenburg position. So head below heart, which helps to bring blood flow to the brain, which just helps to make sure that I had remained conscious during that time. So the shivering went on for a little while. And then at one point I realized anxiety might've been playing a role, and the adrenaline of everything that had just happened. And I came back to all the work that I do with mind-body medicine and realized it might be really helpful to turn to those tools to work through this portion now. Things are stable, the immediate things that needed to be done are done, and so now I can just focus on helping my body to go into that rest state and allowing it to heal. So I asked if I could get a hand with putting on one of the hypnosis tracks from the hypnobirthing course that I took. And I put on the one that was based around fears and addressing fears with birth. And immediately when I started that hypnosis, again, the world around me sort of closed off. I really went into my body. I didn't even know who was present in the room anymore. I was so just internal with what I was feeling. And something quite miraculous happened as I was being guided through this hypnosis track, and as I got into that deep hypnosis state, my vitals started to shift. So my blood pressure started to rise, my heart rate started to rise, and within 10 minutes of starting the hypnosis, the shaking that I was experiencing, that shivering, stopped. And as this was happening, my healthcare team was literally going into the hall, grabbing nurses and doctors that were around and saying, come into the room, like come and see what's happening in here. It was quite amazing to experience it as well. Like I could feel that state shift happening as it was taking place. So once I finished that hypnosis, I felt rested, I felt calm and happy again. I was there, my husband was there, Amelia was there, she was sleeping at that point, and I just knew the whole time, I just knew I was gonna be okay. Later on in the evening, so we're approaching midnight at this point, the OB came back and had recommended a blood transfusion. And I have to say, the care that I received from the OB was really phenomenal. Very patient-centered. We had full conversations about consent. I was given risks and alternatives, and I was given the space to be able to discuss the options that were being presented to me with my midwives who were present and with my husband, and to have time to kind of digest that information before making an immediate decision. And this was really important to me. This was one of the things that, should I have ended up with a hospital transfer, I really wanted to still feel like I had control over my body, and that informed consent was happening kind of at every step of the way, unless there was an emergency situation where they needed to act for me. And so she left the room and we had that conversation, and with support from my team, I felt it was the right decision to go ahead with the transfusion. And as soon as I started with that blood transfusion and the iron transfusion, I started to feel significantly better within minutes of that happening. So I ended up sleeping for the night. We called our family in the morning and they drove up. We had a lot to fill them in on. We had made the decision not to call them the night before as all of this was happening. I don't know if it was so much a decision as it was that I just wasn't in a position to make a phone call at that point. Once everything had stabilized, it was just time for me to sleep. So they showed up in the morning, and everything from that point moving forward was great. We had support. I had that check-in in the morning with my healthcare team, and it was determined later that morning that things were looking really good and that things were stable, and that if I wanted to go home, that I was able to do that. And I was really happy to be able to go home. The only thing that ended up being a long-term sort of complication from that was my blood levels, even with the transfusion, were fairly low. I had lost quite a bit of blood with the postpartum hemorrhage that I experienced. So I was anemic afterwards. I did take an iron supplement and was really aware of what my diet looked like over the course of the next couple of months. And I really prioritized rest, even in that initial postpartum period, which I feel like the greatest lesson that I learned from this is that if everyone felt like they were allowed to ask for help to get the kind of rest that I was able to get, I think everybody would have so much of a smoother postpartum experience if they had access to that support. We had my mom and my mother-in-law staying with us 5 days a week at that point, one or the other. So there was always a third set of hands, and that allowed me to be able to get stretches of 2 or 3 hours of sleep at a time before I then needed to get up to feed. And so having that protected time to be able to sleep, that was something, it was literally a prescription for me. It was, you need rest to be able to heal. And so I took that very seriously. But again, I think if everybody realized how important that piece was and was able to ask for help and had access to another set of hands to be able to have that protected time to sleep, it ended up being a really beautiful 8 to 12 weeks in that postpartum period because I was still getting good rest. So let that be a lesson to you as well if you're watching this. And that concludes our birth story. We had a little bit of everything. We had the home birth that I never knew I wanted to have, but ended up being my absolute dream situation. And if you're wondering, yes, I would do it again. If we have more babies, I plan to have them at home. And same philosophy that we went into this birth with, and that if and when a hospital transfer is needed, then we go. Interesting thing with what happened with my birth, because a lot of people hear this or did hear this and thought, oh my God, like this is exactly why I would never do a home birth. If we hadn't given birth at home, the outcome likely would have been the exact same, because I didn't have that hemorrhage until 4 hours after I gave birth. I would have given birth in hospital. Everything would have been good. I would have gotten the all clear. And it was 4:30 in the afternoon when I gave birth. I would have wanted to come home and sleep in my own bed. So when I was discharged at 7:30, I would have made my way home. And then when I got home, that's when it would have happened. That's when it happened, when I was at home, that I had that hemorrhage, and then I would have ended up back at the hospital. Whether I had given birth in hospital or at home, it was the same situation. And I had that conversation with my healthcare team after to understand what sort of risks are present for subsequent births, given that this has happened, and what would we need to do differently, or how would that look different? I felt very reassured by that conversation because my entire team had also done quite a bit of research after this event happened to have a more well-rounded understanding of what those risks look like, and making sure that if I did choose to do a home birth in the future, or any birth, whether it was a hospital birth or a home birth, that we would know that there are elevated risks for having a postpartum hemorrhage again, and how to be prepared for that. So things like making sure that there was an IV line that was ready to go, knowing that my uterus might have some trouble with the contraction piece, and being able to use an oxytocin injection or another medication that would help to stimulate those contractions. It's not to say that it would happen again. We think that the reason, if there's any risk factor whatsoever, one of the reasons that this might have happened was because my initial prodromal labor that lasted for 10 days may have exhausted my uterus to the point where it was just really struggling to continue to contract after I gave birth, because the placenta was fully intact and my pregnancy was picture perfect, and I had no risk factors for this happening. So it can happen to anyone. There doesn't have to be any risk factors. But if there was one thing that might have led to this happening, it could have been that my body had sort of been in and out of labor for 10 days before I gave birth. So we know what it would look like in the future, and I would plan to do that home birth again. But we also had that hospital experience, and it was also really positive. I really enjoyed the team that we worked with there. I felt really well supported. I felt that the informed consent was there, and so I felt really supported in both environments. All of this to say, giving birth was the most amazing thing that I have ever done. I felt so powerful. I felt so strong after I gave birth, and just in awe of what our bodies are able to do. It is incredible what our bodies are able to do. And I hope that I have the opportunity to do it again in the future.